already more than half of humanity lives in a city. By 2050, it'll be around 3/4. By the end of the century, almost everybody will live in cities. That's good in a lot of ways because it makes energy, water, everything, all of these things much more efficient.
From Ackroyd Lowry, I'm Oliver Lowry.
And I'm John Ackroyd.
And this is Urban Forecast, the show where we talk to the people defining the future of our cities. We discuss their background, what drives them, and the insights they've learned along the way.
This is a podcast for anyone who's interested in how we live, work or play in the cities of the future and what that means for the built environment today.
Gaia Vince, welcome. So great to have you on the show and for you to just introduce yourself and then give us a little bit about your journey into the field that you are now working in.
Yeah, hello. Great to be here. So I'm a science writer and broadcaster, and I started in science at university, and then I kind of moved more into writing and writing about science. So that's kind of what how I started. I started by looking at the Anthropocene, which is this human-dominated world that we're now entering, where humans control everything from the temperature of the atmosphere to where rivers flow to where cities are built, which are completely, entirely artificial landscapes after all, and everything from farming, which is again an artificial landscape, and coastal erosion, everything like that. So I went on a 2.5-year journey around mainly the global south to research that, and that became my first book, Adventures in the Anthropocene. And then my next book was Transcendence, and it was really about how a smart ape became this human dominating force. So about our cultural evolution, and it's mainly thermodynamics, sort of mediated through culture. So how it's about our sort of search to harness more and more energy, because I think that is a huge evolutionary driver for all species, but particularly for us. And we harness more energy than any other creature, and so it has allowed us to take over our world. And this latest book, Nomad Century, it's a look at the future, really, about the immediate future, so the decades coming up this century. And what I tend to do is take a sort of more planetary perspective, so step back and look at our globe, and look at the Earth systems, how they affect the globe and how they affect humans and how humans affect the Earth systems. So I'm looking at that and our continuing trajectory as we heat the planet and cause more and more extreme weather events, which are driving people from many of the places that they've lived for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, because a lot of the tropics is going to become more and more uninhabitable, coastlines as well, a lot of river deltas, and of course that's where many of our biggest cities are located. So people are going to have to move, and I'm sort of looking at where they might move and how we might manage that to make it not a catastrophe, but make the best of a really terrible crisis that we're facing over the next decades through managed mass migration.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about mass migration. Only today you had the Home Secretary talking about an invasion, and using quite language which is quite unpleasant, and it's quite interesting to sort of hear your perspective on how that could potentially be a positive aspect in terms of how we look at cities and movement of people in the future.
Yeah, so immigration, migration is fundamental to almost all species. They all move according to seek better opportunities and to avoid dangerous places. Humans actually are a little bit more sticky than many creatures. We tend not to move even when we're in danger because of all the cultural ties and the social aspects of our lives, which keep us rooted to homes that can be really, really dangerous. And we see a lot of disasters affecting people where really, they were avoidable. People could have avoided them if they had moved, but we make it so difficult for people to move. that many die unnecessarily. But migration is, a fundamental part of being human. All humans migrated until relatively recently. We all know people who have migrated. Most of us do not live in the same house that we were born in. We've moved for work, for opportunities, for love, for curiosity. We all move. It's completely normal. It's nothing that should be demonized. But relatively recently, we've put up a lot of border restrictions. And when I say relatively recently, just in the 20th century, many countries were trying to encourage more immigration to build their societies, build their economies, because immigration has huge economic benefits for countries. We all need more truck drivers, more people in hospitality, more nurses, more teachers, more kindergarten support. We have a worker shortfall generally, and the more people you add to an economy, the more productive that economy becomes. But we also need policies in place to make sure that is smooth. That is a smooth transition. So we need huge investment in housing provision, in healthcare access, in education, in all of the services that people expect from their governments. And at the moment, many governments are failing to provide those for the existing citizens, let alone new people. So that can breed conflict. And additionally, what you were referring to is we have this increasingly toxic narrative around migration, which has been allowed to persist without being countered really by centrist and left-wing parties. And it's bad in Britain. It's not just in Britain though. Many nationalists, the rise of nationalism generally has been really, really dangerous and really scary. And this idea that we should demonize people from other places it's ridiculous, because, these are the people that enrich our societies. If we look at cities, they're entirely built on immigration. Almost, every city was fundamentally built on immigration, but for them to persist, otherwise they die out. And even the most nationalistic countries know that. Even places like Russia and Japan are suffering a really big shortage of a demographic crisis, essentially, because we're not having enough babies to look after our aging populations across particularly the Northern Hemisphere, but most of the developed world. So we actually need more migration, not less, but we need to handle it. We need to handle it with huge investment, which will be more than repaid in terms of these financial investment, in terms of infrastructure, services, and so on, but also social investment, because we do really need we need policies that are genuinely inclusive and really educate people about the many benefits of migration, as well as helping new socially cohesive bigger societies form, because climate migration is now inevitable. We don't know the scale exactly, because it depends on how hot the planet gets and how well we adapt various cities and places around the world to these more extreme temperatures. We're looking at anywhere from tens of millions to hundreds of millions, so possibly even more. So most people will be moving north, and they will be moving to cities. So we need to start talking about this and planning.
I think that was the when I read your article in The Guardian about it, it's just resonated with something that John and I were talking about, where we see that cities could almost end up being the sort of the life raft of humanity. If they are the thing that can deal with this planned mass migration, if we do them correctly. And I think the food systems that support those cities are probably more complicated, but the actual building a building that is low, that's in a new place that wasn't previously as inhabitable, and building it from scratch so that that it can be net zero and it can produce its own energy, and that's a sort of an optimistic outcome that I think aligns to what your vision is. You can't really prevent climate change now, so instead let's be optimistic about how we deal with the impact of it. And I think that was something that it struck a chord with us.
Yeah, a certain amount of climate change is inevitable now. So we're already at about 1.3, 1.35 degrees above the pre-industrial average. We've seen pretty much non-stop catastrophes across the globe, from 33 million displaced in Pakistan to, we had heat waves in Europe. In Britain, I had to take my kids out of school. It was too hot for them. We've had hurricanes and storms knocking out power supplies across the world. This is at 1.35. We're going to go up. We're going to go a lot higher. I think it's very unlikely now that we will keep below 1.5 degrees. I also think it's fairly unlikely we'll keep below 2 degrees. And this is at the end of the century. So no one is talking about us incrementally rising over the century. We're going to go much higher. And then if we're lucky, we can kind of claw the temperature down to 2 degrees by the end of the century. That pathway is very dangerous. So cities are the answer. Cities are, they are the home of our civilizations. Obviously, that's what cities create. But this urban migration has already been underway for nearly a century now. So we're already, more than half of humanity lives in a city. By 2050, it'll be around 3/4. By the end of the century, almost everybody will live in cities. And that's good in a lot of ways, because it makes energy, water, everything, all of these things much more efficient. What happens on the way to cities is that people from very poor rural environments move to a city, and their consumption goes up massively. So consumption of electricity, because maybe they weren't even on the grid before, so they had no power. Now they have power. So all of that goes up. But I will say that this century is a century of upheaval. So wherever you live, even if you personally don't have to move, you will still have to adapt. We all have to adapt. All of our infrastructure has to adapt. So we have to be, we have to make all our buildings zero carbon. Buildings will have to work a lot harder to produce their own energy. They won't just be consuming energy, they will be producing it as well. They will be recycling water and other and heat and other things within our buildings. Everywhere will have to adapt. I mean, Britain's housing stock, for example, is extremely poor. Even within the context of Europe, it's really poor in terms of it's badly insulated, very little generates any energy. It's not fit for purpose. It's not fit for the century of extreme weather that we're going to have. So everywhere will have to be different. And when we rebuild and retrofit, we will have to do it to a much higher standard, which already should have been implemented. I mean, in 2016, when they removed a lot of the building code requirements, massively weakened them. It's completely shocking, because what's happening is houses are being built now that need retrofitting. It's completely unnecessary.
The new building regs coming out this year are pretty tough, and they're quite good. In terms of, if you're producing a new building, actually its performance should be pretty good. Just the levels of insulation that you're now required to provide. It's a positive thing, but what it does is it focuses all that attention on new build, and it entirely ignores an existing stock that
there are some very simple policies that could dramatically change sustainability across cities. For example, all public buildings could be mandated to produce a certain amount of energy, whether that's through rooftop solar, whether it's through heat pumps, anyway, and that would immediately reduce the costs for private property owners and residential developments. If you just think about the enormous, like the swimming pools, the libraries, the mayoral buildings, the schools, all of that, it could be producing their own energy, and that sort of public policy, forward-thinking public policy that's much more progressive, could spill out into other areas as well. Like, what about for school dinners for children? If 2 or 3 days out of 5 they were purely vegetarian meals.
Yeah.
It would improve the health immediately of school children, have that benefit, but also it would mean that fruit and vegetables were, you know, procured in much greater quantity, and that would help with pricing. It, you know, and it just sets a different tone for the rest of society. But at the moment, we're really lagging on a lot of these things.
What are the other, you mentioned there's a couple of policies you think that's an interesting one, and is there any others that you think that would really make a difference in terms of the cities of the future?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research that we're going to need a lot denser and bigger cities over the coming decades, even if we were not looking at migration, which we have to. You know, the global population is going from 8 to 9 or 10 billion, right? That's a lot of extra people, but also places that are relatively safer will need to absorb more people. So the cities are going to need to be denser, and we need to think about how that works in terms of society. And it looks that, you know, blocks of 4 to 6 stories that are very integrated in terms of the sort of zoning of use. So so they're walkable. So within 15 minutes of your home, you can access pretty much all the amenities you would need day to day, whether that's a school, healthcare, you know, grocery shopping, sort of slightly more industrial shopping, things like B&Q and that sort of thing, and light industry and commercial areas are all integrated, recreation all integrated, so that you don't have the current situation, this very suburban, a bit like some of the garden cities, I guess, where you have these huge zones of residential that are zoned off far away from a block of shopping mall, and the only way to get there really is to drive, and it's, you know, that's a very inefficient way. It's very low rise, it uses a lot of land and energy, and it's what we've got is this kind of sprawl that's happening, and we can counteract that. I mean, if you look at Europe, generally is a hell of a lot better on this than America, but if you look at the older parts of European cities, they are all integrated because people did walk everywhere, and it's not just better in terms of energy efficiency, it's also better in terms of society, because people do interact more. There is more of there is more of a society, essentially. You have a lot more communal spaces which people own with their own bodies, rather than being zoned off for cars or commercial ownership of some kind. And you know, we need to think about materials, planning, architecture, and also that whole sort of social psychological side of what makes a city livable.
Yeah, because I think one of the most radical applications of some of these ideas is this the Neom. Do you know Neom? The city of Neom.
Oh, that
it's the line.
The Saudi thing, yeah.
Yeah, and he's very, like, not saying whether I think it's good or bad, but it's incredibly radical. It is very radical. It's like they've taken a very radical stance of a future of urbanism where I think everything's supported by an electric railway. There's no cars. It's incredibly high density. So some of these ideas, they're sort of like building it in the desert, and it definitely has some other negatives, but I sort of admire its radicalness.
Yeah, I don't like that at all. I think it's completely, well, it's mad to build a city there for a start. It's extremely expensive in terms of well, money, but also energy, water, all of the things that Saudi Arabia classically doesn't have. You know, it might work as a small venture of kind of, you know, as an experiment, sort of weird city, fine. But when we're talking about practical big mega cities, I think a better example is what Japan is done quite well, which is a very large sort of city, but it has lots of neighborhoods, sort of concentrating on the neighborhoods. So the city itself is enormous, but rather than the heart of the city being the one zone, and then as you go progressively out, it gets either slummier and slummier and more crap and less integrated with the commercial center. You instead have a much more organic nature of various, which I mean, if you look at London, that's how London is created, I guess. It's the swallowing of many villages. So there are these neighborhoods which, if we weren't in some sort of horrible recession, would be sort of thriving areas of activity. And so you have each unique neighborhood as part of the greater city. And I see that really more as how society could work much better anyway, in terms of our nations. Like if you look at the EU, you don't lose your identity by being part of this bigger union. You're still German or Belgian or whatever. But you have the benefits of the greater thing while also having your own kind of nation within it. So I really think building on that is the way forward in terms of how we integrate large numbers of people through cities that all connect.
Net zero master planning, that's sort of the you've got to take the principles of how an efficient building works and then apply it to a city scale. We started this practice because we wanted to try and solve this problem. Like the scale of the problem is so big that trying to design a building that fixes the problem isn't really possible. So that's sort of the purpose. No,
exactly. So you do have to. This is what I mean about decent policy. So it needs to be integrated at a higher level. So, for example, with heat pumps and so on, they work much more efficiently when it's not every household buys their own heat pump. That's completely crazy. Where instead you take a large, like you dig up the street to put broadband down, like we all did a few years ago, and then before that it would have been gas or whatever, phone lines. So you dig it up and you do your heat pump that is communal for the whole. Then you get a much more efficient use of energy for the whole street. It becomes much more doable, and you can also have hot air circulating and that sort of thing rather than or liquid. You can use either, but you have a much bigger area for everybody to share, and it means that apartments and houses can all tap into the same thing, because at the moment there is pretty much zero strategy on any of this, and it's a real problem. If you look at parklands, if you look at they are huge spaces that can be delivering geothermal or heat pump energy to a huge area.
You get 3% of the golf courses. If you covered them in solar panels, you could get Britain to net zero.
Exactly. And I actually would much prefer to see that, because I think golf courses are probably the ugliest landscape we own.
I think it's an interesting one, around the sort of two things that come up for me there. One, which is about the energy point, which obviously at the moment with Ukraine, everything else, is suddenly brought to the fore, and the cost of living crisis, energy, suddenly people, who might not care necessarily about sustainability and the planet in a kind of political or interest way, suddenly you're interested again. And I think that point, I mean, I was interested that still now we were speaking to Savills Earth a couple of weeks ago, and they were sort of talking about actually why are we not getting, we can get solar farms up and running in 6 months time. Even faster. It's
solar and wind is now extremely cheap and extremely rapid to roll out. We've had a moratorium on land wind farms, which is completely crazy. I mean, it makes a lot, obviously rolling out offshore makes a lot of sense, but onshore it's really cheap and really quick. And really effective in this country. We actually have really good wind provision on the British Isles in various places. It's crazy that we're not using it, and these are not permanent set in stone structures. We can decide in 20 or 30 years, when we've managed to, I don't know, put up more offshore wind farms or make, we can decide to move them if we want. But it's completely crazy we're not doing this immediately right now, because we could be providing all the electricity and a lot of the other energy that we need through our own provision of it's certainly wind, and to a large extent solar as well. But we also have really good geothermal potential in this country as well. So it's completely mad, actually.
Yeah, well, we went up to the Labour Party conference a few weeks ago to talk about sustainability. Yeah, and we talked a lot about decarbonising the grid and, you know, creating green electricity. And then also retrofit, which is a big kind of interest of ours, and how important that is. That hopefully future governments and this government will kind of take seriously. But there is
not this government, the next government.
Well, we hope this government will, you know.
Well, this government, who knows?
Of all colours need to be pushed. It doesn't matter.
Well, they do, and Britain has actually escaped a lot of the problems that other nations have had in not making this a massively partisan issue. You know, both parties have signed up, all parties, I should say, there's more than two, have signed up to net zero and to the idea. I mean, it makes so much sense, even if you're not worried personally about carbon emissions, to move to net zero. I mean, it's you basically, once you've installed it, your energy is almost entirely free. I mean, and the fact that we're walking along breathing all the car fumes as well, I mean, it's completely crazy. We'll look back on this time and we won't believe it. Just like, you know, when I was younger, you couldn't go in a pub without your eyes streaming and your clothes stinking of cigarettes. Now, you know, if one person lights up, you can smell it immediately. You're like, my God, you know, you really couldn't see across a pub before. We put up with that madness.
Yeah, we just didn't notice it as well. I think that was it. You know,
we need to move to a transition where, you know, if you're walking along an A road and all the cars are idling and belching out all this crap, you know, that is unacceptable in this century. It really is. We should have moved beyond this by now. And it's been, you know, we actually need progressive, proactive policies to do that, because as soon as we get even a slight push in that direction, everyone goes for it, because most people, you know, are behind this. Our you know, our needs are aligned. We want clean air, we want clean water. I mean, the water situation is just unbelievable that we're still, you know, in the 21st century, we're literally putting sewage into our water. I mean, it's just, it really is unbelievable to me.
I was reading one of your articles recently about the George Monbiot book, and he talks a lot about the rivers and the kind of pollution that's going from agriculture. And that was one thing I was interested in, on your perspective, if we're going to build these big cities of the future. So we have more mega cities. I don't know, will London even be here if it's sort of under a couple of meters of water? But other cities, how do you have any thoughts? Do you share his views on how we can create the food chain to support the cities?
Yeah, well, we do need to move much further to plant-based diets. We don't need to move entirely to plant-based, but we do need to move that way. You know, meat really is should become a treat rather than something we have every day. I mean, we just literally can't we can't feed the entire globe as it is now on the meat diet of an American. I mean, that would be impossible. We'd have no wild lands left at all. But the way we make meat is very, I mean, it's cruel to the animals, but it's also terrible for carbon emissions. It's terrible for wildlife and diversity, because it involves cutting down enormous amounts of forestry and other wildlands, you know, just to grow the food to feed the cattle. And we get a tiny percent of that. It's the most inefficient way of getting calories, nutrients, protein, everything. It's much, much more efficient to eat the plant directly. You know, we don't need to go 100% plant-based, but we do need to make a large move. And that's actually easier right now than it has ever been, because we can cook generally with you know, pulses and vegetables, you know, already. But now we also have a lot of artificial meats and novel meats, so proteins made from insects, insect farming, or I can't remember, I don't think he talks about any of that, but for me, that's, you know, you know, from algae, from various other bacteria. That there are so many ways now of fulfilling that meat requirement. And a tiny policy shift again would massively improve that industry in terms, you know, it's a horrible, farming is a horrible industry for farmers as well. They have a hugely high suicide rate, really high levels of depression. It's just, you know, they're operating generally on absolute margins, and it's not sustainable in every way. It's a really damaging industry. If it completely transforms, so people eat almost entirely plant-based diets, then the meat that we do produce can be produced much more ethically, and you know, for everybody's benefit, for the farmers as well as the land.
I was quite interested in what you were talking about, social and cities, and you know, they're not new ideas. For example, like Jane Jacobs, you know, Death and Life in Great American Cities, one of my favorite books, and she talks a lot about the planning system sort of killing the organic nature of the city. And I think
it's a huge thing. And if you read books, you know, written in the 18th or 19th century, I think it's really interesting to note how many sort of chance encounters people make, and how many, you know, dropping in on each other and meeting. And, you know, the society was a lot more street based than it is now. People use the public space differently. We just don't have that now in the same way, and it's a huge shame.
In terms of, I think we're going to get to Gaia's policy recommendations, but like, what do you think? What do you think would help that? You know what I mean? Do you have
I think you need to build it in right from the start with design. It does come down to design. It comes down to making sure that there is public fronted space that's not there just to sell something, that there are places to sit down, community places to sit down, that there is planting, that cars, which are very alienating, because that is just one person sitting in a vehicle and the whole road has to be cleared for that car to drive around safely. Where you take the car out of the equation, then you have people moving in all directions. You immediately get a lot more mobility. And it's also due to well-timed and well thought out connections between places. It's not okay to put huge developments of people, a massive bank or tower of residential buildings, often for people who are already marginalized from society, the very poor or migrants who don't even speak the language. It's not okay to put them somewhere miles away from shops, work, businesses, markets, everything, and not even adequate transport links back in to the city proper. That's not okay. You have to make sure that where people live is also where they play, work, socialize, you know, and form a society, right? We're social creatures, we're super social, and we need to live in the heart of, you know, so that we can feel we belong and be part of the creation of that society. Otherwise, of course, people feel ostracized, because they actually are. The ostracism has been planned into the actual building. The landscape is ostracizing them, let alone any other policies. You know, they are literally removed from the social heart and the society that they're supposed to be part of. And planning does a huge amount, can do a huge amount to draw people in and make sure that these places work completely differently. We see that, I mean, one of the best examples of that, I think, happened during the pandemic, when cars were banned from streets and they became play streets, and you suddenly saw children outside playing, but they weren't playing as solitary entities. They were interacting, and then the parents obviously come out and interact as well. And you have a small neighborhood society blossoming there, you know, but there are a lot of policies that try and break that up. You know, everything to do with where you're allowed to have a shop, where you're allowed to, you know, have a pub or a cafe, or all these things. The closure of libraries. These are public spaces. They're absolutely vital for society, because they're not based on commerce. They're based on sharing a public good. And we need more. We need libraries for books, but also for toys, for clothes, for everything. That's what we need to integrate into our society to make them these, we could easily have cook stations, where people come, especially in the summer, instead of barbecuing, but they're kind of like, the energy is shared. So it's much cheaper. People are sort of cooking communally, and then they can go and sit outside on tables or take them back to their homes. We could move much more to a situation where we genuinely have community built into our cities, from the floor that you walk on, the streets that you walk on, that are built for people and cycles and electric vehicles, rather than for these huge cars.
Yeah, no, I think it's very much
aligned to what we think.
Aligned.
Good placemaking can create communities in, like, placemaking is a bit of a buzzword, but design is so important, I think.
It really is, yeah. And people like guerrilla gardeners who go and plant seeds everywhere.
Well, exactly.
So we have wildflowers. We should be planting flowers and planting vegetables, because it's our community area and we want to take care of it, and that's our home. Our home doesn't stop at our front door.
It comes on nicely. I hope one of our next guests is going to be a lady called Alice Holden, who runs urban farms around London. So I think it's quite interesting. So I do think that's a kind of interesting thing, in terms of they're all about community-based people and getting people to grow and make things in the kind of community, and actually trying to actually find cities can be quite biodiverse compared to the countryside now, which is actually because there's so much use of pesticides and other things.
Exactly. You're much more likely to see a fox here. They should get all the fox hunters to come down to Catford.
All right.
So Gaia, how can people get your books, the new one, Nomad Century, and the other one?
So they're available in all good bookshops, and by definition, if a bookshop doesn't sell my book, it's not a good bookshop. And online, and so I'm wandering Gaia online. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for today. It's been really, really fun, and
great to meet you.
Fantastic. Thank you for the time. Really appreciate it.
Cheers.
If you enjoyed the show, then please subscribe and give us a review, ideally a 5-star one. And if you want to know more, please go to ackroydlowry.com or follow us on Twitter @ackroydlowry and Instagram with the same. This podcast supports Land Aid, the property industry charity that brings together the sector to deliver life-changing projects for young people who really need it. Visit www.landaid.org to find out how you can help end youth homelessness.